Hello and welcome to an introduction to programming using Visual Basic exercises for beginners. This exercise is called US Senate. We have a file called Senate112.txt, which is a text file that contains the members of the 112th Senate before the 2012 election. We have another file called RetiredSen or RetiredSenators.txt that contains members who left Senate after the election, and yet another file called NewSen or NewSenators.txt that contains newly elected senators in 2012 election. And we have four things to do. We are to write a program that uses those three files and create a new file called Senate113.txt that contains records for the 113th Senate. The next, we are to write a program that determines the number of senators for each party affiliation: Democrats, Republicans, or Independent. Then we'll write a program that determines the number of states whose two senators have the same party affiliation. So each state has two senators, and we will determine whether the state has both Democrats or both Republicans or both Independent, and we'll find out how many states are like that. And lastly, we are to write a program that asks the user to select a state from a list box and then displays the two senators from each state. Alright, so how will we do that? How will we construct the 113th Senate and write it into a file? Well, we have the three files, one that holds the senators for the previous Senate, then we have the file with the senators that left the Senate, and the one that has the new senators. So we'll simply combine these three files and basically remove the non-re-elected senators from the Senate 112, and then we'll add the newly elected senators. So this is our form. The task 1 through 3 will simply be displayed in a message box. We'll display how many senators there are, how many are Democrats, how many Republicans, Independent, and how many states have the same party affiliation senators. So there's not really any direct input. However, the last task, they want us to have the states listed in a list box, and when clicked, we'll display the senators for that state in another list box. So I'm in Visual Studio 2015, this is my form. There is no button to click, everything will be basically done on the form load. So I'll just double click the form, and here's my form load event. But before we go there, let me just show you the format of the files. So here's my 112th Senate file. So as you can see, there's just 100 senators. We start with the name, then comma, then state, comma, and then party affiliation. R for Republicans, D for Democrats, and I for Independent. So from this file, we will remove these senators, the retired senators. You can see there's 15 of them. So we will remove them, and then we have a file of new senators. So these are the 15 ones that will replace the retired ones, and add them instead of those. The first thing, let's get the files loaded. So we're going to run queries that read all lines from the file 112.txt, RetiredSen.txt, and NewSen.txt. So let's start with the 112.txt file. And that's fairly simple. We'll simply do a link query. I'll call it original Senate, and that will equal from the, let's say, variable senator, because we are looping through senators, so this makes sense to call it senator, but you can call it whatever you want. This is really just to select the data from the original Senate query. At the end, we'll use the select statement. So from our senator in, and we are going to query the Senate112.txt, so we are going to read all the lines. So we will use the IO for input-output file.read all lines from the Senate112.txt. And that's all there is to it. Now we simply use the select statement and select all the data that we just queried, which are now stored in our senator variable for the query. So that's our first query. The next one, we are going to use the same principle and going to query the retired senators. Alright, so here's my second query. As you can see, the same way, I'm looping through the file RetiredSen.txt and selecting all the data from it. And lastly, I'm going to query the new elected senators. Alright, so these are my three files. Now I have three queries: original Senate, retired Senate, and new Senate, and I can now combine them. So first, let's get these senators, the retired senators, removed from our original Senate. These are the ones that are not going to be part of the 113th Senate because they were not elected. So we are going to create another query, and I'll just call it, let's call it remove retired. And once again, we are going to use from, I'll call it senator, but this time we are going to query our original Senate query. And the way we are going to do it, we are going to get all the names from the original Senate except the ones that we have in our retired Senate. And there's actually a keyword, except, that is part of the link query. So it goes like this. We'll simply query the original Senate with the keyword dot except. And except which query? Well, the retired Senate query. So again, we are querying the original Senate except the names from the retired Senate. Everything that matches from the retired Senate and the original Senate will be removed from the original Senate. It won't be part of the removed retired query. And once again, we'll simply select our senator, which is the data for the senator's name, state, and party affiliation. It holds all three data. So now we have our new Senate that contains all the names minus the retired Senate names. So now we can add the new Senate to it. And there's a keyword for that, for a link query, that is called concat or concatenate, which basically means to add. So once again, I'm going to create a query, and this time I'll call it final Senate, and it's going to be from, just like before, senator. And this time we are looping through the remove retired query, because that one contains all the names minus the retired senators. So we are going to loop in that, remove retired, and like I said, the keyword is concat, and you can see it concatenates two sequences, and the second sequence that we want to concatenate is to add the new senators which are contained in the new Senate query. And now we will of course select all the data which is stored in the senator. Now, even though I have senator here and here in all of these queries, they are local to just each of the queries. Like I said, you can name them whatever. You can name them senator 1, 2, 3, or whatever you want. It makes no difference because they are simply used to be selected data. It's not just the name, it's all the data, the name, state, and the party affiliation. Alright, so we have our final Senate. So now all we have to do is use this final Senate query and write a new file called Senate113.txt. And to write a file, we will use the write all lines. So we'll do io file.write all lines, and we are creating the file that is called Senate113.txt. So that's the first argument. And the second argument is what we are actually writing, what lines are we writing, and we are writing the final Senate query. So all the data from there. And this is going to create our new file. Alright, so that's the first portion of the exercise. Now on point 2, and we'll combine it with point 3, we are to determine the number of senators for each party affiliation. So we're going to count how many there are Democrats, Republicans, and Independent. So once again, I'm going to create a query, and I'll just call it query this time. And it will be just like before, from senator in, and the file we are going to be using is the query final Senate, because that's the one we are determining. That's the one we are counting. We're counting the party affiliation of senators of the 113th Senate we just constructed. So we will query that one, so final Senate, and we need just the party affiliation. And if you look at the file, or any of these files, they have the same schema. They have the name, comma, state, comma, and affiliation. So it has three pieces of record. The first record is the name, which would be the index 0. After comma is the state, which would be the index 1. And then there's the affiliation party, which would be index number 2. So we are going to use a split and split it by comma and use the index number 2 to get the party affiliation and just count them. So I'm going to create a query variable. So I'll use let, and I'll call it party, and it's going to be a string. So it will be senator dot split, and we are splitting by the comma character. And like I said, it's the last piece of information on the line, so it's the index number 2. That will give us the party, and we can now select the party. So basically now we have a query that returns a bunch of R's D's and I's. So now all we have to do is count how many there are of each. So I'm going to create a few variables. I'm going to create a variable of integer type called Democrats count, another one for Republican count, and one for independent count. And I'm going to set them all to 0 to begin with by default. So now we can just loop through our query and count all the letters. And to do that, I'm going to use a for loop, very simple, for I as integer. And we are looping through the whole query. So we are looping to the query dot count minus 1, of course, 0 based indexes. So now we'll check if the character that is returned within each index is a D or R or I. So we will do an if statement. If the query of the index I returns D, then we have a Democrat, so we'll increase our count. So our dem count will be plus equals 1. We will do else if the query of the index I returns R, then we have a Republican, and we can increase the count of Republicans. If it's not Republican or Democrat in US, that means that it's independent, so we'll simply increase the independent count by 1. Alright, and that's all there is to it. Now we have a count of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. So now let's do the bullet point number 3, which wants us to write a program that determines number of states whose 2 senators have the same party affiliation. Alright, so here's how it's gonna work. We need to determine the number of states whose 2 senators are from the same party, as it was said. And since there are 2 senators for each state appears in the file or in our queries twice. So we will order them by state, and that will give us a pair of states, and we'll be able to see if the state that follows the one before has the same party affiliation senator or not. And if they do, then we'll just add them to our list. So I will do a query again, and this time I'll just call it query2, and just like before, it's going to be from senator in, and we are again querying the final senate, which is the 113th senate. So we are going to create 2 variables this time, one for the state and one for the party. So remember, the first piece of information was the name, so state was next, which is the index 1, and then party was the index number 2. So I'm going to use a let keyword and declare a variable, call it state, which is going to be a string, and it will equal the senator that's split, because again these are split by the comma, and like I said, state is index number 1 in our file, and the party, I'll just borrow this because it's going to be the same, is the index number 2. So now we have a state and party, and we can order them and compare if the party of the 2 consecutive states are the same. So first, before we do that, we need to order them, and let's order them by state, ascending. Now we don't need to select the state. At the end, we are only interested in the party affiliation, so we'll just select the party. So after this query, we can now declare a variable. I'll just call it number of states with the same party. It's going to be an integer, and it's going to be our counter. And all we have to do now is loop through our query number 2, and we'll compare the index of I with the one after it. In other words, I plus 1. These are the 2 senators from the same state, and we'll see if they are the same. So we are going to use a for loop, and we are looping through our second query until the count, but this time not -1, but -2, because we are comparing 2 consecutive indexes. If we do -1, then at the end it will try to compare the last index with the one after it, but there is no index after the last. So that's why we do -2. And we are going to loop via 2 steps, because 2 states are now ordered together. In other words, if the first state is Alabama, then the second state is Alabama. If the third state is Alaska, then fourth state is Alaska. So we are going to skip those, because we don't have to go through one by one, but in pairs. So we will do a step, and it's going to be step 2. In other words, 2 records at a time. And we will simply do an if statement. If our query with the 2 of the index I, if that one equals the next element or the next record in that query, which would be the query 2 with the index of I plus 1, then we have a match. We have 2 senators with the same party affiliation. So we will add that to number of states with the same party plus equals 1. Very simple. That's all there is to it. So now we have our 3 bullet points ready. So let's create a message box that will display the Democrat count, the Republican count, and the independent count. Alright, so this is my message box. It will display the Democrats, the Republicans, the independents, and at the end it will also display the number of states whose senators have the same party affiliation. It's a simple message box with concatenated of the Democrat count, and obviously I did it to string for these because these are numbers, and after each record or each line I moved the cursor of the message box to the next line, so this will be formatted nicely. Alright, so this gives us the first 3 bullet points. Now the fourth one is to write a program that asks the user to select a state from a list box and then display the 2 senators from each state. Now what we could do is to simply populate our list box with all the states, but we don't have to. If you look at any of these files, including our new file that we will create when we run the program, we have all the states already in our 112 Senate, also in our 113 Senate. We have all the states already there, so we can just list them in our list box, except they are twice. We of course want them displayed only once in our list box. And I'm going to create a third query, so dim query 3 from, and no, not senator, we are trying to find the states, so I'll just call it state in, and we are obviously querying still our final Senate query. And I'm going to create a variable again just for the states. Remember, our 113.txt will have the name, comma, and state. So once again, I'm just going to use a split, and index 1 holds the state. So I will create a variable. I'll just call it states with as plural, and it's going to be a string. And just like before, it will equal the state this time because that's our variable now, state here. So state.split, and we are splitting with a comma, and like I said, states are index 1. And let's order it by states, not state but states, because those are the ones that we are picking. A state holds all the data. It would hold the name, state, and the party affiliation. We only want the states, and we are ordering them ascending, and at the end we will select states. However, remember, there's 2 senators for each state, so every state is there twice. So what we have to do, we only want the distinct. We only want once, so we will use the keyword distinct, which will only select the record once. If there's a duplicate, it will only select it once, and there is the duplicate. Each state is there twice. So now we can display all the states in our list, which is very simple. I'll call the list lst state dot, and we need the data source for the list, which is going to be the query number 3. So we will do a query number 3. However, since this is a list box, we'll convert it to a list. Alright, so now we have to make sure that when the user selects the state or clicks on it, the 2 senators are displayed. So I'll go to my form and I'll double click the lst state list box, and I'll go to the selected index changed, which means that I can click on any data in the list box and I can link them to some other data. So I'm going to create a variable, I'll call it selected state, and that one will equal the text that is selected from the list box. So if I click on the state Alaska, then that's the lst.txt, and it will be passed to my selected state variable. So now I can display the senators from the selected state, and once again I'm going to use a link query. So dim query. This is a different subprocedure, so I can just name it query. It's not the same as the query that I have in the previous subprocedure for the form load. And I'm going to create data in, and I'm going to read the new file that we created when the form loads. Remember, this is possible only after the form loads, so I don't have to worry whether the file is created. If it's not, then there will be an error when the form loads. So if this is available to us, if this subprocedure is available to us, that means that the form already loaded and the file was already created. So I will do an io.file.read all lines, and I'm going to read it this way instead of using the original query that we created here, the final Senate, because like I said, this is a different sub-procedure. I don't have access to that query from here. I would have to pass it to it somehow, but it's just easier to read the file that we just created. And I'm going to pick the senator, so I will create a variable called senator, which is going to be obviously a string, and the senator's name is the index number 0 for the line. Now I'll pick the state, because that's the thing I'm going to actually compare, because I'm picking a senator that represents that state, so I need to know what state it actually is, and I'm gonna compare that with the selected state. So I will create a variable called state. Again, it's going to be a string, and the state is in index number 1 in our data. And now I'm going to use a where clause where I will set the state equal to selected state. If it's not equal, if this state does not equal the one that is selected from the list box, then don't select it from the query. That's basically what we are trying to do. So we'll use a where the state from the query matches the one that's selected. And that should give us 2 senators for every of these states that we click. And now we will just select the name of the senator, which is held in the variable that I created here in the query called senator. And all we have to do now is display that senator in the other list box. So we will do an lst senator dot data source, just like we did with the query number 3 before. So this one we will do the query dot toList, and that's the exercise. So let's run it and see what we get. And as you can see, the first thing we get is the message box that displays that there are 56 Democrats, 42 Republicans. Remember, this is Senate 113th, so it's like back to 2012, and there were 2 independents. And the number of states whose senators have the same party affiliation, there were 35 states that had the same party affiliation for both senators. Now when I click OK, the form should display, and you can see that the states loaded, only 1 state per record, and you can see by default Alabama is selected because it's the first one in the list and has these 2 senators, Jeff Sessions and Richard Shelby. And these are loaded from our Senate 113. Let me just go to my debug folder and refresh it, and you can see that 113th Senate is now created. So I'll double click it, and you can see that there's 100 senators, so that's correct, and the ones that were retired were removed from this file, and the ones that were newly elected were added to it. So this is our 113th Senate. And when I click any of these states, you can see that 2 senators are shown for each of the states. So this is working correctly. There was a lot of link, but I hope you liked it, and I'll see you in the next video.